Now, this is a very special year for our denomination, the 50th anniversary. So we will have a few special moments in memory and celebration of how we started as the United Methodist Church 50 years ago. So this time I would like to call upon the representatives from the Conference Commission on Archives and History and the Conference Historical Society to come forward to share with us the first segment of the 50 years of our denomination. Brent Eaton, as president, will come forward, our Historical Society. So would you welcome him?
Within our community of memory lives an exciting roster of men and women who participated in the formation of this United Methodist Church. Today we will be introduced to Bishop Herman W. Kabnick. Born February 13th, 1898 in Brookston, Pennsylvania, a community of about 75 families of German heritage located about 10 miles south of Warren, Pennsylvania. When Bishop Kabnick was only 2 years of age, his father died, and the family moved to Warren and affiliated with the Salem Evangelical Church. He was licensed to preach by the Evangelical Church in 1922 and ordained in 1927. He was elected superintendent of the Western Pennsylvania Conference in 1939 and was elected treasurer of the Evangelical United Brethren Church in 1950, and then executive secretary of the denomination's General Council of Administration in 1954. At the 1958 General Conference, Herman W. Kabnick was elected bishop on the first ballot and was assigned to the Eastern area. And during the 10 years of his tenure in the Eastern area, he provided the skilled leadership that enabled 6 conferences of the former Evangelical and United Brethren denominations to come together to form 2 effective annual conferences. Following the 1968 union that created the United Methodist Church, he was appointed to the Harrisburg area and became one of the chief architects of the plan and basis of union to reorganize the overlapping EUB and Methodist conferences into the Eastern Pennsylvania, Central Pennsylvania, and Western Pennsylvania annual conferences of the United Methodist Church. He served the Harrisburg area of the United Methodist Church as bishop until his retirement in 1972. Listen now to Bishop Kabnick's take on the upcoming April 1968 General Conference in Dallas, Texas. Pretend, if you will, it is the evening of May 25, 1967, and we are at Grace Evangelical United Brethren Church in Hagerstown, Maryland. The Susquehanna Conference, that's right, has just concluded its 1967 annual session, and the lay and clergy delegates to the 1968 Uniting Session in Dallas are gathered for a time of prayer and discernment. Bishop Kabnick has asked the delegation chair, Reverend Paul E. Horn, for permission to address the delegates. Let's listen.
Thank you, Paul, for arranging for me to address our delegation. A lot of work and just as much prayer has gone into this union. And I admit there are still a lot of wrinkles that need to be ironed out. But I'd like to share with you a few thoughts and concerns and words of encouragement before we head home. First, let me alleviate your fears. This union is not a case of the EUBs being swallowed up by the Methodists. When we 750,000 EUBs join with our 10 million Methodist counterparts, the documents and discussions to date have guaranteed that the heritage and traditions of both denominations will be respected. In matters of form, for example, consider the Lord's Prayer. We UUBs say debts. The Methodists say trespasses. When the new hymnal and new book of ritual is written, both forms of the Lord's Prayer will appear. Consider also the matter of rites and rituals. Consider the ritual for the dedication of infants. The EUB book of ritual contains such a ritual for the dedication of infants. In the United Methodist Church, all rites and rituals of both denominations will be permitted to be continued without prejudice or penalty. In church social work, the EUBs have spoken. We have made it clear there will be no union unless the Methodists end their practice of segregated conferences. In the United Methodist Church, no congregation will be assigned to a conference, will be given a bishop or a pastor based on race. That was not an issue in our EUB church because of our heritage. Not many African Americans were disposed toward the German language and German heritage. But the Methodists should be praised and not criticized for bringing this issue into our union. It was because of their openness and lack of discrimination in their early days that invited many African Americans into the denomination, when many other mainline denominations were keeping to themselves. In matters of church administration, there were a few differences, and some of them affect me as bishop. We EUBs elect our bishops for 4-year terms. The Methodists elect their bishops for life. That's the way it's going to be in the United Methodist Church. That means that in Dallas in April, if you vote for union, you're voting to sentence me to the episcopacy for life without parole. There are other differences too. We EUB bishops actually have it kind of easy. We have very large episcopal areas, and we cut ribbons, we dedicate churches, we preside over annual conferences to make sure all the I's are dotted and T's are crossed correctly. We ordain elders, we serve on denominational boards and agencies, but we don't get involved in the day-to-day running of annual conferences. That's what we have conference superintendents for. In the United Methodist Church, I'm going to be expected to do some work with the annual conference. I'm going to be called upon to get my hands dirty. Then there's also the matter of district superintendents. That issue was probably more discussed than any other single issue in our negotiations. We EUBs elect our district superintendents. In the Methodist Church, the district superintendents are appointed by the bishop. There was a compromise suggested that the cabinet of the bishop in the United Methodist Church be similar to the cabinet of the President of the United States. That is, the bishop would nominate district superintendents subject to the approval of the annual conference. For a while, it seemed as though that would be the new structure, but it wasn't to be. In the United Methodist Church, the district superintendents will be appointed by the bishop as part of the appointment system. But all those differences and compromises aside, I want to share with you a vision I have for the new United Methodist Church. A vision that I think is necessary for our church to succeed, and I think the new church will succeed or fail based on whether or not this vision is realized. And let me share that vision with you. The vision, very simply, is this: if there is to be a union, let it be timely and complete. Now, here's where I'm coming from. This will be my 3rd denominational union. And I know what happens when a union is not timely and complete. My first denominational union was in 1922. I was part of that union when the Evangelical Association and the United Evangelical Church came together to form the Evangelical Church. But let me tell you what happened in Altoona. In Altoona, at the corner of 5th Avenue and 5th Street, was Emmanuel Church. It was part of the Pittsburgh Conference of the Evangelical Association. All the other churches in Altoona were part of the Central Pennsylvania Conference of the United Evangelical Church. In 1922, when the union came about, Emmanuel Evangelical Church remained in the Pittsburgh Conference, completely surrounded by other evangelical churches in the Central Pennsylvania Conference. There were hard feelings. And that lasted for 30 years. Finally, in 1952, all the pastors and all the churches in the city of Altoona were put in the same conference. But by then, it was too late. 4 years later, in 1956, the pastor and congregation of Emmanuel Church left the denomination and became independent. That's what happens when a union is not timely and complete. Let me tell you about my second union. In 1946, when the Evangelicals and United Brethren came together to form our EUB Church. In central Pennsylvania, both the Evangelicals and the United Brethren were strong. And so it was decided after 1946 to continue with two separate overlapping conferences. The former evangelical churches were in the Central Pennsylvania Conference. The former United Brethren churches were in the Pennsylvania Conference. And that continued for 18 years. It didn't make any sense. And it hindered the work of the church. When I became bishop of the Eastern area in 1958, I found that I had to preside over two annual conferences in the same area. In 1962, for example, in May, I presided over the annual sessions of the Central Pennsylvania Conference of the EUB Church at Trinity Church on East King Street. And then 5 months later, and several blocks down the street, I presided at the annual sessions of the Pennsylvania Conference of the EUB Church at 4th Church on East Market Street. What inefficiency. What a poor witness to the world. And that continued for 18 years. It wasn't until 1964, you all remember that, when those two conferences finally got together and formed the Susquehanna Conference. If there is to be a vision, if there is to be a union, my vision is that that union would be timely and complete. And I pledge to you that if I am reassigned to this area, I will make that vision my priority. And I will seek to make sure that here in central Pennsylvania, the union between the EUBs and the Methodists is both timely and complete, so that our United Methodist Church might be united, might be efficient and effective in making disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. That's my vision, my pledge to you, and God willing, I'll see you all again in April in Texas. Thank you for this opportunity.
Wow. Amazing. I heard many stories about Milton Lawyer, how he remembers the stories of our church. He's a walking history and church record among us. And wow. I received a manuscript of this presentation. I just assumed that there would be a video presentation. And he remembered everything and told us the story exactly what's in there. What a gift we have among us. Would you express one more time his presence among us? Whoa. Praise the Lord. Thanks be to God. And let me have a personal moment of privilege at this point. The daughter of Bishop Herman Kaepernick is here with us. She's a member of the First United Methodist Church here in Hershey. Her name is Winnie. Is Winnie here in the house? Where are you? We would like to greet you. Where are you, Winnie Kaepernick? Oh, there she is. There she is. Would you greet her, Winnie? I'm really humbled by her presence here. Lisa and I moved to this community 2012. And then one of the churches we visited very early on was the First United Methodist Church in Hershey. And she greeted me, us, and Lisa. And since that time, she expressed her love and care for Lisa and me every year during Christmas time. Really touched our hearts. The manifestation of amazing, radical hospitality that we experienced by her loving gesture year after year after. So thank you, Winnie. Your presence here really honored me and Lisa. And may God continue to richly bless and honor you and your journey ahead with health, strength, fulfillment, joy, and peace. So thank you, Winnie. Would you once again express her presence with us? And it's amazing that we hear the story of Bishop Kaepernick, the connection we share together. Thanks be to God. Amen.
Now I call on Brent Eaton, president of our conference Historical Society, to come to the podium to lead the second presentation as we remember and celebrate the formation of the United Methodist Church.
It's a privilege to be able to share in these historical moments during this very significant anniversary year for our denomination. Organized in Dallas, Texas in April 1968, our United Methodist Church turns 50 years old this year. And we trace our roots to three distinct predecessor denominations, each of which had a significant presence within our present conference boundaries. The Evangelical and United Brethren churches were two peas in a pod, both essentially German-speaking versions of their English cousin, the Methodist Episcopal Church. When those two denominations joined forces in 1946 to form the Evangelical United Brethren Church, commonly called the EUB Church, not a single congregation was lost on either side. And that is the only major denominational union in American church history to be able to make such a claim. When the EUB and Methodist denominations united in 1968, however, there were isolated congregations as well as a significant portion of one conference that declined to participate in that union. But fortunately, that was not an issue in central or northeast Pennsylvania. The primary founders of those three predecessor denominations were contemporaries, and they were not unaware of each other's ministries. After Jacob Albright's conversion, he joined a Methodist class, and when he became proficient enough in English, he was granted an exhorter's license by the Methodists. He started preaching on his own only because Francis Asbury and the Methodists did not care to work among the Germans. Can't understand that. It was Philip William Otterbein at the famed 1784 Christmas conference that marked the beginning of the Methodist Episcopal Church in America who participated in laying on of hands of Francis Asbury, so that Asbury's ordination and American Methodism could legitimately claim to be independent of John Wesley and England. The threefold heritage of United Methodism explains why so many small communities to this day have more than one United Methodist congregation. In Mechanicsburg, for example, where we find the home of our conference office, there are 3 United Methodist churches within blocks of each other on Simpson Street. Grace United Methodist Church was formerly evangelical. First United Methodist Church was formerly United Brethren, and Wesley United Methodist Church was formerly Methodist. In many communities, the 1968 denominational union also united former EUB and Methodist congregations and led to the erection of new church buildings and unified ministry. One of the first such unions occurred in York, where the United Brethren and Methodist Episcopal denominations had ministries on Duke Street within a few blocks of each other since 1873. By the time of the 1968 union, the United Brethren work had become Second EUB on Queen Street, and the Methodist work had become Wesley Memorial on Tyler Run Road. Now finding themselves within the same denomination, these two congregations, with long-standing ties and mutual interests, immediately began considering the wisdom of uniting into a single United Methodist congregation and produced the Union Study Report in January 1969. The resulting Aldersgate United Methodist Church continues this day as one of our leading congregations in York County. On the multi-point charges in smaller towns and rural areas, United Methodist pastors found themselves waving to each other as they crossed paths on Sundays to serve their overlapping former EUB and former Methodist appointments. It very soon became obvious that charge realignments and/or congregational unions would facilitate better Christian ministry. One representative scenario occurred in Avis, where the Albright and Grove Street congregations united to form a new congregation and erect a new building. The process in Avis, admittedly, was not without some difficulties and delays, but the Avis United Methodist Church exists today as a result of that vision. EUB Methodist congregational unions also soon occurred in Center Hall and Liverpool and across the conference from Lykens to Altoona, from Williamsport to Mechanicsburg. And the process is ongoing. Even after these 50 years, as former EUB and Methodist congregations continue to realize the benefits of coming together for effective ministry. Countryside Community United Methodist Church in Lackawanna County is one recent example. Even as we meet to celebrate 50 years of United Methodism, new possibilities are taking shape as congregations of vision put aside their former identities and buildings to unite for the cause of Christ. The newly formed Carlisle United Methodist Church has purchased land on Spring Garden Street and plans to begin construction of its new facility this summer. The EUB Methodist Union of 1968 also broadened the vision of many of us in a variety of areas of life, including, but not limited to, where our young people attend college, where we might spend our retirement years, and where our children might be nurtured at camp, and so forth. Selecting a college is, of course, a major decision. Prior to 1968, it was not uncommon for young people of former evangelical churches to be steered by their pastors and church leaders to Albright College, for the youth of former United Brethren churches to be encouraged to attend Lebanon Valley, and for the college-bound of former Methodist churches to be informed of the advantages of Dickinson or Lycoming. In fact, the Central Pennsylvania Conference of the Methodist Church had been alternating its annual conferences between the campuses of Dickinson, and Lycoming colleges. Following the denominational union and the assignment of pastors outside their predecessor denominations, such limited and automatic choices for higher education became less frequent. The same bias held true for benevolent homes. In Northeast Pennsylvania, where the EUB Church had a few congregations and no benevolent institutions, the Methodist homes at Tunkhannock and Pittston served before and after 1968 with no real noticeable changes. In central Pennsylvania, however, prior to 1968, those seeking retirement facilities, typically located to Lewisburg, Quincy, or Tyrone, according to the heritage of their congregation. It might also be appropriate to mention at this point that the evangelical home at Lewisburg included the community's only hospital, which later became a major independent medical facility and is still called Evangelical Community Hospital. Bethany Village, near and dear to my own heart, was in the development stages in the 1960s and had really become a joint vision of the EUB and Methodist denominations even before the 1968 union. In addition, both the Evangelical Home at Lewisburg and the United Brethren Home at Quincy at one time had orphanage facilities. Now all of our conference's children and youth services are housed at the former Methodist orphanage, the United Methodist Home for Children and Family Services in Mechanicsburg. And how can we forget church camp? In Northeast Pennsylvania, where the EUB Church again had only a few congregations and no church camps, the Methodist camp at Sky Lake was the place to go before and after 1968. In central Pennsylvania, however, the choice of camp was typically dictated by the denominational background of one's home church. Those from former evangelical congregations attended at Central Oak Heights. Those with a United Brethren background attended Camp Penn, and Methodist children and youth who had for years attended the Methodist training camp at Newton Hamilton were beginning to enjoy new camps spread out all across the conference. The 1968 union has brought about a wide range of choices for all children and youth for that special camping experience. The United Methodist Cross and Flame speak of the sacrifice of Christ and the power of the Holy Spirit. The two portions of the flame were designed to remind us of the two branches of United Methodism, the EUB and Methodist churches. And the slanted edges on the cross were designed to remind us that we are to be a church in motion, always ready for new challenges and opportunities. As we celebrate this year 50 years of United Methodism, 50 years since the coming together of the Evangelical United Brethren and Methodist denominational traditions to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world, let us rejoice in the fact that we are truly better together. And let us continue to trust in God for an even better future. Thanks be to God for the United Methodist Church.
Thank you, Brent.
To celebrate the formation of the United Methodist Church, and I would like to call upon Jennifer Glein. She is a member of the Commission on Archives and History, to come forward and share with the third segment of celebration of our church history.
We begin with a 96-second PowerPoint presentation about the 1968 Uniting Conference. Well, that certainly was a quick run-through of the 1968 conference that formed the United Methodist Church. We're here this afternoon with 50 years of hindsight to see what we did well in 1968, to discuss what we could have done better, and to determine what we've learned as we journey into the future. I am Jennifer Gleim, a member of our conference's Commission on Archives and History. With me are the Reverend Dr. Tim Baer, Senior Pastor at Shepherdstown United Methodist Church in the Harrisburg District, and Terry Heil, a lay member of Asbury UMC in the Scranton-Wilkes-Barre District. Let's start with you, Dr. Baer. In 1968, the EUBs had approximately 750,000 members to Methodism's 10.3 million members. What reason was there for the EUB Church to essentially give up its identity and unite with the much larger Methodist Church?
Well, in Pennsylvania, the birthplace of both the Evangelical and the United Brethren denominations, the EUBs and the Methodists were almost equal in number. But in other parts of the country, the EUB Church had few congregations and little name recognition. With America quickly becoming a very mobile society in the 1960s, the EUBs found themselves on the short end of a national population dynamics. EUB families that moved to many parts of the country found that there were no EUB congregations to join. And often the families that took their places had never even heard of the EUB Church. And even the name sounded strange, Evangelical United Brethren.
But wait, the EUB Church was not really swallowed up. But the EUBs and the Methodists sang the same hymnals, used essentially the same order of worship, and had virtually identical theologies and systems of church governance, including the appointment system and the trust clause for church properties. So the average EUB or Methodist layperson probably noticed no change at all and how things functioned, except for the sign in the front of the church. It was a true, natural coming together.
Here in Pennsylvania and other areas where there was a strong EUB presence, and at the national level, there was a plan and basis of union that guaranteed the leadership positions in the new denomination would be fairly divided between former EUBs and former Methodists.
I agree. In the early years, both the Evangelicals and the United Brethren were often referred to as German Methodists. There's a real sense in which the 1968 Union was merely bringing back together again what differences in language had separated generations earlier. Considering all that, what would you say was the most important thing that was done right during the 1968 Union?
Without a doubt, I would say it was the elimination of segregated conferences. Before 1968, the Methodists had separate overlapping conferences, one for black and one for white congregations. One condition that the EUBs made for the Union was that there was to be no separate conferences based on race.
I certainly agree that the elimination of segregated conferences was probably the most important thing that was done right in 1968. But I can't help thinking that we still have a long way to go.
Terry, would you agree with that?
Yes, I can't speak for the United Methodist as a denomination, but I know the struggles we have had in central and northeast Pennsylvania. Our congregations do not reflect the racial and ethnical diversity of our communities, and our efforts to reach out across racial, cultural, social, economical, and generational divides have been less than successful. The 1968 Union had a vision and made a statement, and now we need to translate that vision and the statement into action.
Well said, Terry. And while we're thinking along those lines about improvements and unfinished business associated with the 1968 Union, can you think of anything that could have been done differently in 1968?
Well, there might have been some wisdom in the EUB practice of electing bishops for 4-year terms. There was always the possibility of re-election so that effective bishops could continue in their leadership roles. But I see some definite advantages in 4-year terms.
Such as?
Well, first, bishops could return to their home conferences with a wealth of insight and experiences to share at the local level as they are reassigned to local churches. The local church is where the people of God are in direct mission to the lost and where persons are discipled and called to ministry, both ordained ministry and lay ministry. To have persons with Episcopal experience mentoring persons at the local level could revive the church from the bottom up.
Wow, that's quite a thought. Anything else?
Well, yes. Secondly, the term structure would provide a way for persons who felt ready to transition out of the episcopacy to do so naturally. And finally, I think the turnover at the Episcopal level would continue to provide fresh leadership, physically, intellectually, spiritually.
Thank you for your insights. In closing, I'm going to give each of you a chance to respond to this question. What would you say is one thing that United Methodism has learned from the 1968 Union that will help us as we face the new challenges of the 21st century while seeking to continue to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world?
Well, I would truly say that one reason the 1968 Union succeeded as well as it did is that everyone entered the discussion with an open and willing spirit. From what I understand, there was no us and there was no them. There was no struggle to protect one's turf or to haggle over details that were simply unimportant in the eternal scheme of things. Certainly, there was thoughtful and prayerful consideration about many things, and sometimes there was disagreements, but overall there was a spirit of unity and trust. Trust in each other and trust in God. I think it's clear that mutual trust and unity can make all the differences in the world.
And how about you, Dr. Bear?
Well, the hard truth today is that our society is fragmented racially, culturally, generationally, politically, and so many other ways. It's frustrating to see that fragmentation creep into the church. But I think one lesson in 1968 is that God wants to bring God's people together. And one day God will do that, in spite of our tendencies to erect artificial walls that are not of eternal significance. Truly amazing to reflect on all the fragmentation there has been in the United Methodism that was finally put aside in 1968. If you think about it, the original Methodist Episcopal Church split into 3 denominations that eventually came back together in 1939 to form the Methodist Church. The original Evangelical Association split into 2 denominations that eventually came back together in 1922 to form the Evangelical Church. The original United Brethren Church suffered 2 denominational splits. In 1869 over the wearing of wedding rings and the use of instruments in the church, and in 1889 over membership in lodges and secret societies. None of these splits were over matters of eternal significance, but they all hurt the mission and ministry of the church. Today, we look back at many splits and divisions in our United Methodist history and realize how unnecessary and foolish they were in the eternal scheme of things.
I agree, and I trust that one thing the United Methodist Church has learned from the 1968 Union is that God desires to bring the believers together. In spite of all the artificial barriers we sometimes place between each other, to make disciples of Christ for the transformation of the world.
Well said, and thank you to both of you.
Would you express your appreciation for their sharing and presentation and